Congratulations, you got a new clip for the microphone. At last. Thank you. I think we read through text number 3 from chapter 5. So I think I'll continue starting. Is that right? Yes. Text 4, 754. Narada speaking to Yudhisthira. My dear King Yudhisthira, once upon a time, the king of the demons, Hiranyakasipu, took his son Prahlad on his lap and very affectionately inquired, my dear son, please let me know what you think is the best of all the subjects you have studied from your teachers. Purport, Hiranyakasipu did not ask his young son anything that would be very difficult for him to answer. Instead, he gave the boy a chance to speak plainly about whatever he thought might be best. Prahlad Maharaj, of course, being a perfect devotee, knew everything and could say what the best part of life is. In the Vedas it is said, Yasmin vigyam vigyate sarvam evam vigyatam bhavati. If one properly understands God, he can understand any subject matter very nicely. Sometimes we have to challenge big scientists and philosophers, but by the grace of Krishna, we emerge successful. It is impossible, practically speaking, for ordinary men to challenge scientists or philosophers concerning genuine knowledge, but a devotee can challenge them because the best of everything is known to a devotee by the grace of Krishna, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 10:11. Tesham ivanukam partam aham agyana jam tamaha nashayam yatmabhavasto gyana dipena bhasvata. Krishna, who is situated in the core of everyone's heart as the supersoul, dissipates all the ignorance from the heart of a devotee. As a special favor, he enlightens the devotee with all knowledge by putting before him the torch of knowledge, torch of light. Prahlad Maharaj therefore knew the best of knowledge, and when his father inquired from him, Prahlad gave him that knowledge. Prahlad was able to solve the most difficult parts of problems because of advanced Krishna consciousness. Therefore, he replied as follows. Tatsadu manye suravarya dehinam sada samudvigna diyam asat grahat hitvat mukpatam grihamanda kupam vanam gato yadaram ashayeta. O best of the Asuras, king of the demons, as far as I have learned from my spiritual master, any person who has accepted a temporary body and temporary household life is certainly embarrassed by anxiety because of having fallen in a dark well where there's no water but only suffering. One should give up this position and go to the forest, Vana. More clearly, one should go to Vrindavana, where only Krishna consciousness is prevalent, and should thus take shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Purport. Hiranyakasipu thought that Prahlad, being nothing but a small boy with no actual experience, might reply with something pleasing, but nothing practical. Prahlad Maharaj, however, being an exalted devotee, had acquired all the qualities of education. Yasyasti bhaktir bhagavatya kinchana sarvayar ganais tatra samasate sara harava bhaktasya kuto mahadguna Manoratenasati Davatobahi. One who has unflinching faith in Krishna consistently manifests all the good qualities of Krishna and the demigods. However, he who has no devotion to the Supreme Personality Godhead has no good qualifications because he is engaged by mental concoction in material existence, which is the external feature of the Lord. Bhagavatam 5:18-12. So-called educated philosophers and scientists who are simply on the mental platform cannot distinguish between what is actually sat or eternal and what is asat or temporary. The Vedic conjunction is asatoma jyotirgama. Everyone should give up the platform of temporary existence and approach the eternal platform. The soul is eternal, and topics concerning the eternal soul are actually knowledge. Elsewhere it is said, Apashyatam atmatattvam griheshu grihamedinam. Those who are attached to the bodily concept of life and who thus stick to life as a grihasta or householder on the platform of material sense enjoyment cannot see the welfare of the eternal soul. Prahlad Maharaj confirmed this by saying that if one wants success in life, he should immediately understand from the right sources what his self-interest is and how he should mold his life in spiritual consciousness. One should understand himself to be part and parcel of Krishna and thus completely take shelter of his lotus feet for guaranteed spiritual success. Everyone in the material world is in the bodily conception, struggling hard for existence, life after life. Prahlad Maharaj therefore recommended that to stop this material condition of repeated birth and death, one should go to the forest or vana. Paragraph. In the varnashram system, one first becomes a brahmachari, then a grihastha, then a vanaprastha, and finally a sannyasi. Going to the forest means accepting vanaprastha life, which is between grihastha life and sannyas. As confirmed in the Vishnu Purana, varnashrama charavata purushena parak puman vishnur aradyate. By accepting the institution of varna and ashram, one can very easily elevate himself to the platform of worshipping Vishnu, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Otherwise, if one remains in the bodily conception, one must rot within this material world, and his life will be a failure. Society must have divisions of Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, for spiritual advancement, one must gradually develop as a brahmachari, grihastha, vanaprastha, and sannyasi. Prahlad Maharaj recommended that his father accept vanaprastha life because, as a grihastha, he was becoming increasingly demoniac due to bodily attachment. Prahlad recommended to his father that accepting vanaprastha life would be better than going deeper and deeper into griham andakupam, the blind well of life as a grihastha. And our Krishna consciousness movement, we therefore invite all the elderly persons of the world to come to Vrindavan and stay there in retired life, making advancement in spiritual consciousness, Krishna consciousness. Well, this verse is often referred to, thus it's important as we'll spend some time on it. there's two places. This is the first of the two, where Hiranyakasipu asks the same question, and he gets a transcendental answer. Now, the affection of a father for a small boy, as Prabhupada is writing here, he's not expecting anything intelligent or lofty, just something that's pleasant and not necessarily meaningful, but it's just an affectionate exchange between father and son. So, at least Hiranyakashipu is given this qualification that he has affection. Obviously material, but some affection that's natural for a father and a son. And his expectation of what reply he'd get from his son was something, childlike, not necessarily meaningful and full of value. Just kind exchange, father and son. And naturally also he was thinking, when he refers to his teachers, it's Shanda and Amarka. So it's kind of like testing the pot, using Prabhupada's example, the pot of rice with squeezing a grain and see how's it coming. So how's the education of my son going with Shanda and Amarka was the intention. And he didn't factor in that Prahlad wasn't really interested in what they were saying, because that's previously mentioned. But he was very absorbed in what he heard from Narada. So Prabhupada is translated as my spiritual master, but that's his teacher. That's what the question was. And the way that Prabhupada has explained the answer is very understandable, although if you don't have the purport, how are you going to understand his answer? What's the best thing that you've learned? Now, Prahlad is indicating the, not the Varna part, but the ashram part of spiritual progress. And the ashram part of spiritual progress is progressive. So go to the forest is a short way of saying enter vanaprastha life. Because in technical terms, that's the meaning, vanaprastha. Vanaprastha. Like when Vishvakarma built the capital of the Pandavas under Vyasadev's request, Indraprastha. So Grahastha, the ashram where Vanaprastha, where one is detached from worldly things. Go to the forest. Detached from worldly things. Now sometimes vanaprasthas would literally go to the forest, and other times the general description is given in different sequences, but the husband and wife will leave family affairs and their children are whatever their children are, because they've spent 25 years developing whatever that is, and that's what it is. And then they go to holy places, but through going to holy places become purified and hear from saintly persons there, which is further purification, and then returning back home and do some more of that, and then after some time preparing for the next stage, the husband will go alone and going out and visiting holy places and doing some of the same things, but without the company of wife. And giving the teachings of Krishna consciousness and whenever possible, etc., etc. So that kind of scenario is what Prabhupada would outline for Vanaprastha leading to sannyas stage. In many cases, Prabhupada would say very strictly, when one turns 50, then Vanaprastha should be taken up. In fact, he was over 50 when he entered Vanaprastha stage, and there were circumstances that precipitated it, that made it an unpleasant event rather than a progressive spiritual event that as it's ideally meant to be. So there's rules, and then there's flexibility of those rules. It's more of a principle. There's just a little further comment. There's a lot of scriptural examples of young life, brahmachari life, and grahastha life. There's not a lot of examples of vanaprastha life. Nor in our present society is there a lot of examples of vanaprastha life. There's a brahmachari ministry, there's a sannyas ministry, there's a grahastha ministry, there's no vanaprastha ministry. And there was a devotee named Janananda, who did a lot of his service in Southeast Asia. He wanted to establish vanaprastha ministry. And as fate would have it, he took sannyas. And not out of repulsion, just that was suited for him. And so that project dropped. There are a couple persons who are living vanaprastha ashram very nicely. I asked one of them to write an article for Back to Godhead magazine, and what is appropriate vanaprastha life, and dandavats.com, etc. So he did. But there's not lots of living examples. There's living examples of exemplary grahastas, exemplary sannyasis, exemplary brahmacharis. So it's not as well defined and as clear, but it's an important stage according to the teachings of the Bhagavatam, and Prabhupada's expressing these points. Perhaps because of lack of clarity, it's not so well known, or is not so much participated in. It's kind of like, if one goes in that direction, it's quite radical. Not always like that, but often like that. So in any case, the circumstance is outlined in those who are too much griham andakupam, where the griha becomes a blind well. And in the West we don't know so much about blind wells, but I learned about blind wells by some misfortune. Somebody I know fell in a blind well and died, because it was previously used well and then went into disuse. It wasn't properly protected, and so kind of grass grew over the thing, and he was walking and didn't know it was a blind well and fell in the blind well and died. It's a thing in India, not so much a thing in the West. But it's like falling in a blind well. And you can, if you have a broken limb, you can call out for help, but who's going to hear you at the bottom of a blind well? Like the comparison is being made, it's like that, but where when there's too much affinity for or absorption in the affairs of Grihastha life to the point where one can't let go, one can't be detached, one can't consider my job has been well done. Now let me move on to the next stage of my life where that I need to give full attention to prepare myself for future. It's the Vanaprastha stage is being encouraged by Prahlad, or it's being encouraged by the Bhagavatam through Prahlad. And at least, in a planned way, not in a reactionary way, in a planned way, leaving behind the stage of family life and going towards the stage of Vanaprastha life is recommended. In this case, it's radical. One should just leave and go to the forest or go to Vrindavan. So, Prabhupada's encouragement final section. In our Krishna consciousness movement, we therefore invite all the elderly persons of the world, that's a lot of persons, to come to Vrindavan and stay there in retired life, making advancement in spiritual consciousness, Krishna consciousness. Now, certainly there are devotees that have their long-term plan and of going to Vrindavan at that stage of life. And there's a number of families that have done that or are going to be doing that. And, it's good in making such a plan to not just have a place, but prepare oneself spiritually. That is, go there periodically and become accustomed to the climate, and because it's extreme, commonly, and the way of life there, and the spiritual connections that help to sustain and nurture one's spiritual well-being. And there are, it's a wonderful atmosphere. Those that have spent time in Vrindavan, early in the morning, you can hear the gonging of the gongs and calling out of their conch shells and the kirtan and, multiple temples in those early morning hours having spiritual activities. And all over Vrindavan, it's just a place where it's abundant or replete with spiritual activities and spiritual sound. It's very conducive atmosphere. And become accustomed to that before making that one's home. Or Mayapur, but it's specifically here, Vrindavan. In the first canto, in chapter 9, first canto, chapter, I forget which chapter 13 maybe, where Vidura returns home and encourages Dhritarashtra to leave. There's an indication of 3 stages of leaving and going to the forest. And one, there's degrees of elevation. And the topmost is not the stage that was recommended for Dhritarashtra because he was too much attached. So it was recommended that he simply go to the forest and engage in what Kshatriyas at that time knew how to do, the process of dhyan yoga, and which he did. So he had the capacity he did have the capacity to be detached by the grace of Vidura, because many times in the past, many, Akrura and Vidura and others, tried to help Dhritarashtra become detached, but he couldn't. He couldn't because he was holding on. He didn't want. So the preliminary is to want, and then good association, and then the fruit of that good association of maturing into behaviors or actions in life that are beneficial. And because he's at the final stage of his life, the preliminaries that might otherwise be there weren't available because of his elderly stage of life. So he did what he could do. But even to do what he could do, not the topmost stage, but to do what he could do was the fruit of Vidura's association. And the Vidura gave that association in previous times, which Dhritarashtra honored and acknowledged, but simply said, I'm too attached. I can't do what you're recommending. Honest, yet clinging to the material conception that my son should become the king, if I can't become the king. Very attached. And then, as a result, because it wasn't meant to be, misbehaviors that are rather radical or punishable. Can't help it. Too much attached. So that Vanaprastha stage was like he was in the fast lane when Vidura came, and very quickly he gave up his life because of his circumstances, elderly circumstance. So recommended is not that extreme to Hiranyakasipu, but the directional principle is the same. According to one's nature, one's capacity, etc., one's training, go to the forest, and detachment and absorption in spiritual practice in different ways. That's it. Let's see if there's some discussion.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. I have one question from today's and one from last evening's class, Maharaj. So, Maharaj, as you mentioned, he was honest yet clinging to material conception. So, this is a very, very like practical or very relatable for me, that I can understand the frailties or weaknesses, but I'm not sure if I am doing something to get over, or just thinking that, it will go on its own, or when Krishna's mercy will happen, or something like that. So how to understand and how to step forward from there?
Well, an English word that Bhakti Siddhanta uses is effacing. Effacing, at least the application of the word effacing, my understanding of that word is when coins rub together and rub together and rub together over time, the face the date, the imprint of the date, and whatever the words gets lost because it becomes effaced over time. Another application of that term is the bhakti process itself. And specifically, he uses the term in relation to the chanting of the holy name. It has the effect of effacing material contamination. So on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the one hand, just engaging in the bhakti process, then material contamination becomes effaced. On the other hand, if one goes on committing offenses, then bahu janma kariyati shava kirtana, many births, with limited and appreciable progress. So it's not just the activities, it's the consciousness with which the activities are taken up on the positive and negative side. Or how is the purpose of our devotional activities consciously to know yourself and to know the Supreme and to know your relationship with the Supreme. That makes the effacing process move more quickly, or the eradication of the covering or the illusory feature of life more quickly or more slowly. The consciousness behind, or one might say, sometimes it's said, the effort, the focused effort that one takes while doing prescribed duties, chanting, etc. There's a potency to cleanse and to awaken, and how much that cleansing and awakening effect is there depends on our consciousness or our intention of reaching that stage, the aspiration to go further, and then therefore a very careful and conscious application of the process. Thinking about the chanting of the holy name and thinking about your duties as a mother and a wife and a member of the devotee community and all the other roles that we have. What's the purpose of all those things? As we know, Rupa Goswami says just being attached to the rules can be it inhibits bhakti to grow if we're not understanding the purpose behind. We're just doing. It doesn't make it a zero, but it inhibits the maturing of bhakti. And the converse, understanding the purpose behind, helps or enhances these two purposes, the cleansing and the awakening. Okay, is that the other?
I have two more. So I was thinking, what is the difference between thinking and consciousness?
Well, thinking is a function of consciousness, but it's not consciousness. Consciousness is the soul, and thinking is the mind. Without the soul, what's the mind going to do? It's just a material energy. But behind the mind is the animating force.
So if we are thinking of Krishna, then our consciousness is there or no?
Well, just listen, unpack what I said. And if you understand what I said, then the answer is yes. And if you don't understand what I said, you'll think the mind and consciousness are the same. Or thinking and consciousness is the same. It's not. What is a function of the soul? There's the spiritual mind, and there's a material mind. There's a covering of the soul, or covering of consciousness.
Here again.
The answer is yes if you understand the ontology of the soul. or ontology of consciousness? The answer is yes. And if you don't, then you think they're equal, and they're not.
Last Maharaj, from last evening, like you mentioned one statement, like essence of offense is seeing things material that are not material. Can you speak a little more on this?
Can I explain? Yeah. Next time you take a look at the 10 offenses or 10 offenses against chanting the holy name, consider them through that lens. Here's something spiritual, and seeing something spiritual as being material, that's an offense. Next one, seeing something that's spiritual as material, that's an offense. Next one. They're all like that.
I will go through it.
And the correction isn't just knowledge, it's application of knowledge. It's approaching that which is spiritual in the proper way. So whether it's scriptures or the devotees or the form of the Lord, the purification that comes from chanting, they're spiritual. But we have material conceptions. We're covered due to material conceptions. We're covered by Maya. And so we're thinking those ways through the lens of material. Offense is you just stay there. Clearing is you try to move from there. And pure is you're not there anymore. You're seeing that which is spiritual as what it is. That's pure. That's the pure stage. And there's gradations.
Thank you.
Someone else?
Maharaj, there are two online questions.
Okay.
First question is from Sucharit Devi Dasi, Mataji. She says, Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj, if someone doesn't live to the stage of Vanaprastha, how do they prepare for perfecting life? Like going to Dham at the end of life?
Like going to the Dham, what was the last part?
At the end of life.
At the end of life. It's best to understand the stages of bhakti not as so strictly scripted, but rather stages, a flow from one to another, and there are features of that flow that enhance spiritual elevation of consciousness. So her question is, supposing someone doesn't fully embrace the Vanaprastha stage, but they just go to Vrindavan. That's the question, right? Well, it's a feature of Vanaprastha stage, without necessarily understanding and applying the process. So what Vanaprastha ashram looks like what Grahastha ashram looks like from one family to another family to another family, let's say even like wonderful examples of Grahastha ashram, they may look differently or different. And Vanaprastha same. So the element of leaving behind the worldly and going to Vrindavan at a certain age and stage of life, that's a feature of Vanaprastha. It's not complete, but it's a feature. And the detachment from all of the implications in family life, it is naturally nurtured by that, physical separation from the family affairs, and by the purification that comes from being in the Dham and all of what goes on when you're living in the Dham. So one's consciousness may not be so focused, and thus one may not get the effacing effect as much as if one had that preparation. But there's benefit. You can say there's a vanaprastha benefit for someone that hasn't really prepared themselves and really focused on, this stage of my life and how it's meant to lead me to the perfect stage of Krishna consciousness. There's certainly benefit just by that one act.
Thank you, Maharaj. Next question is from Girivardhari Das Prabhu. He said, Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj, in current world what we are, do all grahasthas need to plan and take up vanaprastha life?
Well, the word plan is a little delicate, but follow the instructions of Scripture is a better. So some kind of, this part of my response has something to do with a class I was hearing Prabhupada speak, recording just this morning. The stage in chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna asks, what are the symptoms of a self-realized soul? How does he walk, act, and speak? Or sit, act, and speak. Prabhupada is explaining this point of plan making. And in the transcendental state, there's no plan making because one is simply an instrument. Prior to that, there's some plan to help follow scriptural instructions. We have to have a plan what we're going to do today to carry out our devotional life. And yes, to answer to his question, yes, but when and how and things like that are quite flexible. But even one's thoughts going in that direction is part of submission to Scripture and Guru Sadhu Shastra. And that what actually happens may be very different than what one's initial and even refined and matured plan might be. That should be allowed. There may be something else altogether that happens.
Well, there is a second part of the question.
Okay.
He says, if someone who is not fortunate to live in Vrindavan, what options he has in living in the modern world?
There's lots of options. I'll leave it up to somebody that's creative to think of other options. I mean, here's a few. There are devotee communities, but there are devotee communities. Some in rural, some suburban, some urban. There are devotee communities where elderly persons don't go to Vrindavan, but they go to that community where elderly persons go, and they focus on their Krishna consciousness without the entanglement of all the things that went on in Grihastha life. So rather than making a comprehensive list, there are people that are thinking like this. Discuss with people that are thinking like this. And the premise that says they're not able. I don't know who's not able. Not willing is one thing. Not able is another thing. Next. That's it. Anyone else? Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.